All right, guys. Are we live? Are we live? Let's hope so. All right, checking YouTube. Going to YouTube. Going to YouTube. Checking my channel. It says we're live. Checking YouTube. Boom. We are live. Wow. Okay, guys. I think that we have a record. We have the new roughest launch for the show. That's number 92. We can only hope to exceed it by the next one. But hello, guys. We are here. Okay. Thank goodness. The wave of happiness on my face right now, you can't even imagine. All right, guys. So anyway, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Pete Bickford, and we'll be talking for the next hour with a good friend of mine, British journalist, publisher, and magazine impresario, Joel Meadows. And we'll be talking about British comics. So if you have anything that you'd like to have us ask Joel or answer about British comics in the chat, please post it. And if you would, preface it with @ComicBase TV. Just a couple announcements to get going before we do. If you guys are watching the pre-release channel for ComicBase 22, with the interim builds. There's a new build that was put out just before Showtime, build number 1700. Does a little bit of different stuff with the hypertextual searching for storylines. We add back the long-lost Italian lira, the currency that got so many magazines through their youth, like Tex and so forth, but unfortunately has become obsolete with the euro. But it's back and it's better than ever, the Italian lira. So if you need that one will now appear when you do quick changing, and a couple of other very, very miscellaneous fixes. So we are wrapping down the 22 programming cycle. Don't expect to see a lot of major changes to that one because we're really focusing all our efforts these days on building out the next big thing of ComicBase. But as we find little things where we get a chance to slide things in, that does change periodically. But give that a shot and we'll take it from there. All right, I think we're good here, guys. And wow, hi from Belgium. Nice. Thanks for joining us here, Fabian. Jeff, and I think you guys should be able to see it. Yes, excellent. Okay, so yes, weird launch of this one. Ed, nice to see you. Richard as well. Greg Armad, of course, is in the house. Thank you very much for making it here. And I think, unless there's any other business, Jerry, Kathy D, I think that's most of the folks that we're going past as we're feverishly pushing buttons. Andre, the guy who's rocketed to the top of our leaderboard list in contributions by doing crazy things like indexing the Times of London. Mike Beam, first in the house, everything. Welcome, everyone, and let's get to it. I'm going to bring in our guest Joel here, and let's take it away. Joel, hey, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yes.
Welcome. Hello, everyone.
It's a very polished and professional production. I always try to keep the standard up. Yes. So Joel, let's first of all let me brag on you a little bit here. I just was lucky enough in the mail to get. This is your which anniversary is it? Dark Horse is 35, but which anniversary of Tripwire is this?
Well, this came out in November of last year, which we would have been doing the magazine for last year. We've been doing it for 29 years. We started in 92, so last year that came out in November of 2021. So that is issue. Let me get this right. I think it's probably issue 57 of our print iteration. We took about a 10-year gap because print ended up being a little bit of a challenge. We went back to print during the COVID period, which obviously was perhaps not the greatest time, but we managed to get it out. We managed to get 2 print magazines out, one in December of 2020 and one in November 2021.
Well, as you know, sometimes it takes a little longer to get things started than you'd like.
Well, yes, that's true.
So what? Let's start with some basics here. So how did Tripwire get started? So for the folks who've not been lucky enough to see it in its print iterations over the years, I'm just going to say Tripwire I think is one of the coolest magazines covering the comic industry going. I'm not trying to soap you here, but there's only really about 2 or 3 comics magazines that I really miss. Comics International, but. Comics Buyer's Guide, who obviously I started working with. They were decided, a lovely bunch of folks. They were purposely light on editorial so they could make room for all the ads and showing up all the new cool things. Which is a bit of I love that they had the commercialism right at the heart of the concept. Whereas
why not?
The rest of us try to bury it with we're just trying to bring you journalism. It's like, no, we're trying to sell ads. And then there were some other ones along the years that,
Amazing Heroes I miss. Remember Amazing Heroes? That was a great magazine.
Wow. Yeah, that was almost before my time. I mean, I have back
No,
issues.
no, no. Surely it wasn't really.
Well, somehow it's just I was always sideways to it. I would wind up getting them as back issues in my
The best
collection.
one of the best things that they do was a thing called preview special, where they would preview a lot of books coming out over the next 12 months, and a lot of them wouldn't come out. So I haven't got them unfortunately anymore, but there was talk of like this Barry Windsor Smith graphic novel that was originally going to be about Superman's first date with Lois and all this cool shit, which never happened.
It sounds terrific. If only it had shipped. Yes.
But
Um,
he's
yeah.
he's quite a slow artist, should we say, Mr. Windsor Smith. So sadly, that didn't happen. But those were the best. The preview specials were amazing.
So how did Tripwire get going?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try and keep it reasonably punchy.
Well, just tell us the sexy bits.
Okay. I had a former neighbour of mine in the row where I lived with my parents, and we both talked about this was in 1991, 92. We both agreed there wasn't a decent comic magazine because CI had started. Don't get me wrong, for the first decade it was a really strong comic magazine, but we wanted something that had covered comics and music. So we started it as a very primitive fanzine. I mean, I wish I could bring some copies. I do have them kicking around the flat, but it started life as a stapled A4 fanzine with a single color cover. When we had with the legend "Lobo is back," which was a pun which didn't work because it should have said "Lobo's back," and it was his back. So 30 years later, it's still hounding me. So we started with that. We did a couple of issues in that format. We moved on. We did like a single color cover, but without the staples, properly printed with a death cover, because we interviewed Chris Pacello and Mark Buckingham when the first Death miniseries, the Gamer one, came out, and we just developed it. We dropped the music because I had a parting of the ways with the music guy, should we say? But we introduced film instead, film and TV, which was a much better fit. So we had comics, film, and television. And so we ran it in print until 2011. But unfortunately, the industry had changed. It was very hard to make it work for itself financially. So we switched to the web. But then 2015, we launched the website. But in 2020, I'd always missed print. So we went back to doing print. And so they're these big chunky magazines. That one's 148. The one before is, I think, about 144 pages. So we want to give people value for money. We want depth rather than breadth.
Well, especially also if you're going to ship this over to an American audience, the packet to send like 1 ounce to Britain is like $13. So you may as well make it a production.
Yes. No. Exactly. So that's in a nutshell. That's the history of the magazine.
So most Americans will know British comic books unless you just are really into the old school stuff. Most Americans know it when kind of like that British invasion took over, where Karen Berger and DC went over in the 80s and basically started up Vertigo and started hiring British creators. Can you talk a little bit about those times?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it started life. Karen Berger was just a regular editor at DC. She was Joel Meadows' assistant, I believe, and she worked on the horror books. And towards the middle half of the 80s, she started to hire people like Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons, who started to get noticed thanks to 2000 AD. And you had, actually, if you think about it, it actually starts with Camelot 3000, which is an ancient book, which some people may be too young on this listen, to actually know that. But that was a Arthurian sci-fi book that was drawn by Brian Bolland, written by Mike Barr. Which would make a really cool TV show if they ever get round to that. But that brought a British artist to the fore. And it also did introduce a few mature themes. And then you also had, obviously, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, which started 83, I believe. It was issue 20. It was a story called The Anatomy Lesson. And it was a very different take, because prior to that, DC had Swamp Thing. He was this silly mutt monster who'd go around, fighting evil corporations. And it was all rather silly. But Alan Moore took it back to his horror roots. And so that was a huge hit. I mean, you probably do remember, that Swamp Thing was massive. It was one of these things. It was like a water cooler thing. Everyone had to buy Swamp Thing. When Moore was writing it, everybody wanted to know what was happening next. And also introduced, John Constantine, who went into his own book, Hellblazer. So it created this huge ripple effect.
Now, Brian Bolland, if I'm not mistaken, the Batman Killing Joke cover, was that Bolland?
Yes, well, he did the whole book. But yeah, obviously that classic cover as well, which was in 1988. I believe it was 88. And again, as you say, that was an iconic thing, and it all fed in because the British artists brought very different sensibility to the work, as did the British writers. They brought a slightly different take to what people were used to with the Americans. So they brought something completely fresh and completely new. And Vertigo started. It didn't start with a name. It just started with a few books, Swamp Thing and Shade the Changing Man and Sandman, and then they decided to group it into a named imprint. So Vertigo launched in February 1992, which is interesting because we launched our magazine the same weekend that Vertigo launched, because they had their launch in a restaurant in Covent Garden in London. So we share a little bit of lineage there.
So, those comic books, from that era are really, they're some of my favorites. I mean, they're the ones I keep going back to. I mean,
yeah, of course.
It just, because for me, growing up with Marvel superheroes, and I mean, you could like Spider-Man, you like Daredevil, things like that. But at a certain point, you get to be a teenager, and it's like, yeah,
you want more, don't you? You want something else.
You're kind of growing out of it, right? And
yes.
Whereas France has a long history of like bande dessinée and things like that,
and Italy as well, of course.
Right, where you kind of transition into more grown up themes and more adult fiction. America, it seems like you go straight from, at least at the time in the 80s, you went straight from Captain America to heavy metal. So if you wanted to see naked space chicks,
yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
But it wasn't really the same. It was like. And then suddenly, with Vertigo and the British books, and it was suddenly you could like, wait a minute, we could actually explore adult themes in comic books in a way that like you're not embarrassed as a teenager enough to read.
Yes, I mean, actually, there's one other bit of lineage I need to mention. That predates Vertigo, is that Vertigo would not have happened without Archie Goodwin and Epic Illustrated, which was Marvel's adult magazine in the early 80s, which had everybody from Mobius to John Bolton to every major artist, Bill Sienkiewicz. It was a phenomenal read. I remember borrowing them from my brother, and you talk about this idea of like a bridging point. It was, think about heavy metal. It was always too bizarre for me as a kid, I have to admit, because I found it was almost, I didn't know what was going on. There were all these weird blue naked aliens wandering around, with pyramids and things. It looked stunning, but I couldn't have any idea about what was going on in terms of the story. But Epic Illustrated, you had Metamorphosis Odyssey, which was Jim Starlin's kind of slightly weird, freaky sci-fi series. You had the Black Dragon by Chris Claremont and John Bolton, which was amazing. Kind of like sword and sorcery fantasy series. You had, as I said, you had everybody. Anybody who's anybody. You had Mobius. You had every major creator of the time.
Sorry, I'm trying
to track down some Epic.
Well, I'm trying to get my computer screen to play along, and it's decided.
Yes. But yes, so I have to. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Epic.
Yeah. No. Sorry,
because it was a major influence.
All right, there we go.
Oh, perfect. There we go. So that's a cover by, I'm not sure who that is. Can you blow it up, Pete?
That one's Frazetta.
Oh, it is Frazetta. Well, there we go. I mean, Jesus, the king of fantasy comics. They got him. I mean, Archie Goodwin. I know he's gone. Okay, don't worry. But
on the show, Batman: The Killing Joke. Of course. It's like one of those ones where, like, the second you see it, everyone knows this cover.
Oh, it's an instantly recognizable cover, as you say. It's incredibly iconic. There we go. Yeah, I mean, and that book was a huge hit because they went back to press multiple times, so that logo is a different color. I think there was a purple one and a yellow one.
It's like the way you tell the printings apart is,
it is an incredible cover. I mean, the composition is, and you got that. You had Arkham Asylum, getting back to Grant Morrison, which was this bizarre Batman story that was, which is quite surreal. Like all of the Batman villains, they're these archetypal monsters. So it's a very gothic book.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let's go Batman Garth. See, unfortunately, the cover, as much as I love, as much
I know the cover is a little bit abstract.
That's not the one that's
quite give you the flavor of the book.
Yeah. Now, when did, and that was also Dave McKean on that one, correct?
Indeed, yes, and Grant Morrison, yes. That that book sold 200,000 copies through, if people remember, the book clubs, which used to be able to order books. I don't know. Do you remember this, Pete? This concept of you'd order your books. You'd get 4 books a month, and eventually they kind of drove me a little bit crazy. But they were huge. But that book, I said that book sold 200,000 copies. This is a £20, and that's price rather than weight. Like a $25 hardcover. Well, sold. I mean, that's just staggering to imagine that now. I know you get books that sell well, but in 1988, a Batman graphic novel sold a ton of copies to people who weren't even comic readers. These were the general public.
I think, in 1988, if you bought like one of the really mature ones that they're starting to print on like Mando paper and all
Exactly.
things like that, I think you were laying out like $1.50 a comic book, and nobody could understand that. It's like, how could anyone spend this much for a
That
comic book?
much when it's normally 75 cents or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, Mando paper. Is no, but you're also paying for, again, this
You're
whole
paying for
wrap.
production values and the fact that you're paying. I guess what you're buying with that, and it's the same with stuff now, is you're buying like an object. You're buying into an object, like an object of beauty. It's all about the way the thing's designed. I mean, the comics. I mean, you remember this? They used to be, their design was very, very basic, but since the 1980s. And this goes for some American comics as well, is that there's a lot more care taken with the design of these things. They are graphically designed, whereas in the old days, they just slapped the logo on and they'd have like a picture of Superman. And it was incredibly basic. But, the idea of graphic design almost came in with the late 80s, and it has stayed. And I'm pleased it has, because you got people like Ryan Hughes and a guy called Tom Muller, who actually, they make their living out of doing graphic design for comics.
Sure. I mean, and Neil Adams, who just passed, obviously, when he wasn't, because he was a full-on graphic designer.
Well, yes, exactly.
But so Vertigo comes in there, starts poaching all these, amazing British creators, which I got to think at the time were probably pretty cheap.
Oh, they were, yes.
Anyway, well, I mean, it wasn't that hard to because it's funny, because it was the first time I saw people getting hired for their writing as opposed to coming in and getting hired because you were a flashy artist.
Yes.
And so suddenly names like Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman and such are getting known to American audiences, and it almost doesn't care who they're working with graphically. Sometimes it's like you're so excited to just see the writing.
Yes.
But so Sandman was, what year was that?
1988 or 89. I think it was 89. I think it was 1989.
So of that whole class of folks who got brought over with Vertigo, it feels like Sandman's the one that really stood the world on end. I mean, it had the most staying power as far as being able to stick within the DC system for as long as it did. It was a signature talent. Vertigo, the Vertigo imprint got formed around it, and so forth. It feels like Alan Moore. He's more erratic to follow. He seems to burn very bright but briefly. How would you characterize his career?
Well, it has been quite sporadic. I mean, there was a period, as you say, you had Swamp Thing, had V, you obviously had Watchmen, and you had some of his superhero work, which was pretty impressive, and then Leisure and Gentleman, which wasn't bad, but again, it couldn't sustain, and it's a shame, because he's got bored himself, with the subjects that he used to tackle, which is understandable. You can't go back to the well and tackle the same subjects over and over. I mean, I kind of see more almost a little bit like a kind of Martin Scorsese or a Francis Ford Coppola figure, where, they've done some amazing work, and they've kind of got nothing to prove now, because, they changed. I mean, Moore and Miller, I mean, they must be bored sick of people saying this, but, the both of those creators, comics has never been the same because of their work.
Well, it's funny, because I think Alan Moore's probably the only guy I know in the comics industry who gets less credits as the years go by, because he keeps taking his name off of things.
Yes.
I picked up the Miracle Man compendiums recently, and
yes,
and it's like, well, who wrote it? The writing's quite good, and it's just written by the original creator. That's literally how it's.
I mean, it doesn't have his name.
No, not at all.
I mean, if you watch the Watchmen TV series, it says co-created by Dave Gibbons, based on the comic. It doesn't say created by Alan Moore.
Who's the co-creator? Yeah, don't know.
Yes, exactly.
No idea. Don't know.
He's some mysterious bloke at the back, the enigmatic figure behind the curtain. But it's kind of a shame.
So the British stuff started getting brought over, and again, it feels like suddenly the college educated people could get into comic books. I saw, there was I remember like a Leather Jacket. It's like the one that got away had this amazing hand painted version of the Killing Joke. Wow. A joke back of it, and like I'm killing myself to this day. I didn't buy it because it was sitting in the shop window for like $100. But you start seeing stuff like this in pop culture. You started seeing, like, again, Generation X suddenly had something worth reading when you were an adult. I mean, you wouldn't be embarrassed to take the bus home reading Killing Joke, and I mean, it's not the same as like just reading this issue of Conan.
No.
But So it feels like times were pretty good, through about 2000-ish or so. Vertigo was doing good. They're one of the first publishers that there's only a few publishers in all of ComicBase that we actually have to break out. There's so many titles they put out. We have to break out the alphabetization to a
Oh,
deeper level.
really? Oh, wow.
But Vertigo was always one of the ones that was like standard, built into ComicBase on every level, to that deep level. And then come the 2000s, it just seems like it went poof. What happened?
Well, I think a lot of things happen is that there's that Vertigo. They weren't quite architects of their own destruction, but you had Image come in. Image started in '92 as well, actually. But to be honest, to begin with, Image was just like a really poor photocopy of Marvel with these really questionable superhero books, and then it took. You could argue it took The Walking Dead, which was slightly later, which I think was 2006 or 4. I can't remember exactly, but the early 2000s.
Kirkman, yeah.
But that changed everything, and Image it was Kirkman, but it was Eric Stevenson, who's been at Image for a number of years, who brought in books like that, and they kind of took Vertigo's model, and they said, look, we can give you a better deal. You keep the rights, you have you have the film and TV rights, you have total control over what your book is when it's coming out. And so in a way, Image kind of stole Vertigo's thunder a little, and so British writers, they started moving away, and it was just inevitable. It's going to happen. I mean, Vertigo did very well for, let me get the 92 to about a decade. They were on top of the world. They were unassailable. You had things like Preacher, and you had 100 Bullets, and you had a load. I think they might have been slightly later, but you had some great books. But and then when Karen Berger left, which was much later, I'm jumping forward a little bit. Then the rot really set in, because they didn't know what to do with Vertigo when Berger had gone, because it was such a single woman's vision. Vertigo was. It was her thing. I mean, it was her genesis. It wouldn't have existed without all of the incredibly hard work, that she put into it. So, and when now she's gone, like once your big guy's gone, once the woman or man, the person at the top who was here, it's very difficult to replicate that.
So, I want to go back in time just a little bit.
Well, of course.
Screw it. Now I'm sitting there going, well, because I feel like it's funny with British comics. It's almost like when you find a really good band, and it's like you've never heard them before, but it's like it suddenly is like the coolest album ever. You can't wait for the next album, but in the meantime, you start running backward in the catalog.
Yes. Oh, yes.
How far backward can I follow these guys before they're absolutely crap?
Yes.
So
yes.
Oh, no, what were you about to say?
That wasn't the question. Okay.
Oh, no. So what I was supposed to say is, so I'm getting really, interested in British comic books, and
yes,
and for me also another big one that bears mentioning is the whole 2000 AD Judge Dredd stuff.
Oh, yes.
This, by the way, is an actual copy of 2000 AD number 2.
Is it with the Space Spinner as well?
I did not have the Space Spinner. This one,
it's worth more with the Space Spinner, I believe.
Yes. So if you guys can see these at all, these are printed on bloody newsprint. It's like the worst. As far from a modern comic book as you could possibly get. I'm sure the acid, would probably eat your hands.
I'm fairly sure I'm amazed it's still intact after 45 years.
Yeah, well, I'm not the only person in America who actually managed to find not only the bag.
What year did you buy that? Obviously not 77. You bought that in the 80s, presumably.
Yeah, probably 89 or so. But I managed to actually locate the person who had the U.S. distribution contract.
That is impressive, to be honest.
For 2000 AD, and somehow he was like, your goal, young man, is to get these distributed in America. He apparently did absolutely F all.
Oh, dear. Oh, well, but he sold a copy to you, though.
Well, no, but what happens is he had like his own copies of all this stuff, and because I'm the only guy in America who's asking for 2000 AD. Suddenly, a comic guy let me know. Like, well, this one guy came in. He said he used to be the sales rep. Could I reach out to him? I said, yeah. So I made a deal to pick up the first 200 issues of 2000 AD. I think
of course, issue 2 is the first appearance of Judge Dredd.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which you obviously have a copy of as well.
That is this right now. He didn't even make the cover back then.
No,
but
yes.
That's the first issue of him in there. But so 2000 AD is it's an anthology that ran in Britain. I want to say started 76. That sound about
77 actually. So it's 40. It's the 45th anniversary is this year.
Okay, that's close. But the thing that just blows Americans away is this thing was published weekly, and
yes.
every issue would have about 3 or 4 different stories in it. They would, and sometimes there'd be like little one page stories, like Tharg's Future Shock.
Yes.
Tharg was like the evil robot host. He was like the crypt keeper.
Exactly. He was a green alien with this strange thing in his head who would introduce the comic. And even now, when they run the letters pages, they would always address it to Tharg. So basically, anybody who becomes editor of 2000 AD, it's they become the green alien. It's kind of, it does feel kind of odd, but I mean it's a tradition that they've had for years. It's for 45 years, and they've kept it. So I guess fair play to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, but the one thing that was really great about it, though, is it was terrific because you had an option, because they're producing so bloody much work.
Yes.
There was always a chance to get in. So if you had a halfway talented artist writer team, you could walk in with like, I'd like to run a 4 or 5 issue serial of some brand new character we just thought up, we pulled out of our butt 2 minutes ago. Or better yet, if you were just even like a writer, you could produce, you could say, I'll pitch a 2-page Future Shocks and so forth. So if you look at like Garth Ennis's first published work, it was stuff like that. I believe Grant Morrison as well. They all got work. They probably paid £50, for placing a single story.
I think one of Grant Morrison's first stories was a thing called Zoids, which was a kind of sub-Transformers thing. And I think it was a Marvel UK magazine, which I think Grant Morrison wrote a couple of stories for, but obviously he got noticed through 2000 AD. I mean, the thing about 2000 AD is that almost every single significant British comic creator from the 1980s to the late 90s, or even into the 2000s a bit, they all got their start on either 2000 AD or the magazine, which was the monthly sort of 2000 AD companion magazine.
Right. And I was trying to think. It seemed like for British comic creators, it's kind of like the equivalent of working at McDonald's. It's like,
it wasn't great money, but you got seen, you got spotted. If you did a strip for 2000 AD and and it was well received, then Karen Berger, getting back to Vertigo, she'd do these trips. Even pre-Vertigo, she would come over to meet British creators, and she would basically poach them and say, look, this guy's great, we should use him. It started life with the superhero books, and then it moved into Vertigo. So she would come over once a year on like a talent spotting trip. So she would come to UCAC, which used to be the old British comic show, which she used to go to set up at, and she would look for talent, and she would pick the talent, and she would basically nick them for US books.
Oh, but by the way, just for the Americans to set up this one, you guys have all seen Comic-Con. UCAC, the UK Comic Arts Convention, is in the early years of ComicBase. I basically wanted to go to London. But the nice thing is when you have a business, you can fob off a lot of idiot ideas as long as you do some work over where you're going. You can say, well, we're just going to make a presence in Britain. So let's attend the UK Comic Arts Convention. You bring your trade show set up with you and whatever else. And I don't know if we ever sold more than like a dozen copies over there, but but it was brilliant because again, it's such a small, intimate show. It's almost like a little hotel room show. But the first one I ever went to, and that's how we met. I believe we were booths next to each other. As I remember, there was like come 3:00. It's like the show floor kind of winds down.
Because we never went to the bar.
Everyone wanders into the bar, and then you're sitting there having drinks with Brian Bolland and everything. It's like, this is bloody brilliant. I want to do this all the time. And so, it was hard to justify financially, but it was like just the chance to meet these guys, hang out and have a beer with them was absolutely worth it. By the way, what is the state of comics shows in Britain right now? I mean, obviously everything was shut down for a couple of years, but where do people go to meet and talk comics these days?
Well, I mean, shows have come back. Basically, thought there was Thought Bubble last year, which is the biggest. It's the biggest traditional UK comic show, and it gets 20 to 25,000, which obviously is kind of chicken's feed for US, but for a UK show,
that's huge.
It's not bad, but most of the other shows get between like 5 and 10,000. So your MCM, which gets far more than that. MCM, which is like an American style show, which was bought by Reed about 4 or 5 years ago. That can get about 100,000 people. I mean, that takes over XL, which is, since they demolished Earl's Court, I think it's the biggest exhibition space in England, and so they get kind of manga cosplay, Funkos, that kind of thing. So, I mean, there are shows. There's quite a few. I mean, obviously, COVID put the kibosh on that for a couple of years, but they are coming back. And I went to Thought Bubble last November, but it was a fairly buzzy show. So you've got that. You've got the Lakes, which happens in October. You've got quite good. There's a show called Lawless we're going to, which started life as a 2000 AD show in Bristol, but it's still 2000 AD, but it's not officially sanctioned by the publishers. But you get people like Brian Bolland there, Mike McMahon. Jock was supposed to come, but he had to pull out. But there's a lot of great guests. So there are a lot of shows again. Shows have come back over here, to be honest.
So let's talk about new things happening over in Britain. So right now, I mean, you see everything. What would be like if you're going to just turn on an American to 2 or 3 different series that you'd be like, check this out, kid, you'll love this.
Okay, it's an interesting time. There are a lot of things happening. I mean, I'm going to start. There's a magazine called Shift, which I arranged to have a copy sent to you, which unfortunately hasn't arrived yet, probably.
Sadly not. But if it shows, I'll feature it later on.
Basically, it's an anthology. So in the British tradition, it's an anthology. It's a strip anthology, and it's distributed into the UK newsstand. So it goes into Smiths, it goes into UK newsagents, and it's a grab bag. So it's a mix. So it's an anthology. So you've got everything from sci-fi to fantasy to horror, and that publishes monthly. And you've had people like Gary Erskine in it. You've had a lot of reasonably prominent creators, and it's an impressive magazine. There was a magazine called Comic Scene, which was a features magazine, which I used to write for, which used to have some strip material. But Comic Scene ended, and it's kind of been rolled into Shift. So that's one magazine. So I recommend Shift if people can track it down, which I'm hoping that they can. The other thing I'd recommend, there are 2 connected magazines. There's one called the 77, which is basically, it's like a love letter to 2000 AD, and it was started by these guys on kind of almost like a shoestring, and they've really built it up. So this is, as I said, it's like a love letter to all of their 2000 AD stuff that they enjoyed reading, from the late 70s. And so they do specials now, and they've also done a magazine called Blazer, which is, I guess it's like a pastiche sort of, it's not quite a satire, it's a pastiche of other late 70s kind of British magazines. Like there's one called Action, and there's one called Battle. I think there was one magazine that got banned, I think, because there was a very violent story, and I think Pat Mills used to work on it just before 2000 AD. So Blazer is like it's like a homage, if you like, to late 70s British comic magazines. So the 77 and Blazer I would recommend, and I know they do send to the States. So if you can track down their websites, then I'm sure that they would happily take people's PayPal money in exchange for their fine products. So you've got that, and then thirdly, I'm going to mention a publisher rather than a specific title. There's an indie publisher called Time Bomb Comics, which has been around for, I think it's, let me get this right, I think it might be 15 years now. Started by a guy called Steve Tanner, and he does lots of really cool British indie comics. He picked up a thing called Harker, which was originally published by Titan by Vince Danks and Roger Gibson. He did a thing called Flintlock, which is very cool. It was basically about this. She's a female. Oh God, sorry, my brain's not working. I've had a very long day at work. Like Dick Turpin, so she's a female highway woman. That's it. Sorry, female highway woman. So Time Bomb Comics, as I said, they do a lot of really cool books. They use the Kickstarter model to fund it, and they're very, very canny because they set the target very, very low. But his publisher Steve Tanner he knows his stuff, and they do some really cool books. So as I said, and I know that they could probably furnish people with copies of some of their titles. So I'd recommend people checking them out as well.
Do they ever? Sometimes I see this done in digital format. So, for instance, one of the more effective ways to get, if you're an American, to get like a lot of cool British comic books is something like Humble Bundle. We'll do these amazing deals with, here's 45 graphic novel compendiums that from our history for $25 or something like that.
Well, they haven't, but I guess they might have considered. I mean, it does sound like a really good idea. I mean, the nice thing is that it seems a lot of indie publishers they do work with each other. There's no kind of sense of competition. Mostly, it does feel like there's a really nice spirit over here of British indie publishers. You see a lot of them at the similar shows, and they all seem to get on really well, and they all like to they're all happy to help each other out. I don't know if they've never done a formal thing like that, but it does sound like a great idea, to be honest.
Yeah, so it's at some point we're gonna have to have like some kind of like behind the scenes industry show, just at some other point. But one thing, it was funny, you did in your Tripwire, you'd done a roundup of like here's top 50 people, kind of like
Oh,
movers.
these are the power list, yes, which
power list.
they're a lot of fun. I mean, I have to say, as a caveat, I have to say that they are basically pretty meaningless, because it's myself and a couple of friends that we sit around and we go, he should be in it, she should be in it, and then we kind of move the pieces around. It's like a kind of weird version of chess. But,
sure.
but they are fun, and they're good talking points, and I think they're just a bit of fun, basically.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I don't often think about the corporate end of the comic industry. I mean, we're usually just sitting here indexing comic books all day long.
Of course.
We kind of do our thing. We're not really worried about,
No.
We'd like to make sure it keeps going, but yes. I'm not really worried about w's the new hot executive over at DC.
I know. And to be honest, there aren't that many people who are, but people who work in the industry, are interested in it. But it's trying to find the balance, because I'm sure that a lot of our readers, they don't really care who's, managing editor of DC or editor in chief of Marvel. They just want their books to come out, and they want to come out on a timely fashion, and they want them to get, creators whose work they like to work on them. So I think there's a very small amount of people, but it is interesting, because it does, looking behind that curtain, for us, it puts things into context, because there are certain people who have had amazing careers because they know their stuff. Like, for example, Jim Lee, who is in our power list. He's an incredible man. He started life, as an X-Men artist, and he's moved up the ladder because he's got an amazing business acumen, and now he's DC's. I'm not sure what his job title is, but he's one of the top 3 people, at DC or something.
Yeah,
something like that. So think about that, man. I mean, it's not unusual, because in the 70s you had Carmen Infantino, who was DC's publisher, and he started life, as a very talented artist. So it does have previous, if you like, but it's interesting to see who's at the top of these companies.
It's also interesting because I'm going to say it's a view I don't get often, where because you published this a while back and it took a while to ship it and send me all the items.
Yes.
I'm reading this power list, and I've just gone through like 6 months of listening to basically the whole YouTubeosphere slagging on half these guys. It's like,
I know. I mean, people criticize DC. I mean, the thing is that during COVID, it was very tough. I mean, some companies adapted, others couldn't quite adapt, like DC. I mean, you feel a little bit sorry for a company that is so huge, that's owned by a huge corporate master, where decisions take forever because they can't move quickly, because they're a huge, they're a small cog in a giant wheel. So they're the powers that be above them, at Warner's, and I think it's Warner's Discovery now. No, so it's not Warner's anymore. It's Discovery.
Warner.
Well, it's something, but it's changed hands. But like big companies, they can't move quickly. Like small company, they say they meet a creator that they like, and they go, we like your stuff. In 3 months they could publish a book of theirs. But with DC or Marvel or any of the bigger companies, the wheels move so slowly that they can't make decisions that quickly with newer talent.
So, I mean, it does feel like when Karen Berger came over and started recruiting, what eventually became the Vertigo line.
Yes.
And Marvel, in their own ham-fisted way, was trying it with Epic, and which again, there's some great things that came out of Epic. I mean,
there were
all the ones that I like
Dread
reading.
Star came out of Epic, and I'm trying to think loads. So it's Moonshadow as well, obviously, which is a book which has moved publishers since. It was Dark Horse in the last edition, but it was an important book. James Mattis and John J. Muth and Kent Williams. I mean, it was a very bold book, because pre-Epic, could you have imagined the same people that publish X-Men and Spider-Man and Daredevil publishing, a coming of age story about a teenage guy a Jewish teenager on a spaceship? I mean, with a hippie mother. I mean, that would have just sounded like insanity to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely nuts stuff. And Marvel, even when Marvel's trying to be daring with like their magazine lines, because those weren't subject to the comic.
Are you talking about the Curtis ones, like Savage Swords and all those others?
Yeah, I mean, it was more than you got just reading it as a 13-year-old, but it also, it was never going to be like a whole different sort of thing. It was more like
it still felt like a comic. I mean, How the Duck magazines were quite bold, I guess, because they did some weird stuff in those. But as you say, Savage Swords and all of those kung fu magazines, they did Master of Kung Fu, and they did a Planet of the Apes magazine as well. So they did some rather weird stuff, but it wasn't stuff that pushed the envelope for the form. Really, it was stuff that was licensed books. It was stuff that was, to be quite honest, was still pretty safe.
Yeah.
So it's by a bit more violence, but it still wasn't really like a more mature take on the character.
Yeah, and it also feels like the management over at Marvel didn't have. They didn't. I don't feel like they had the commitment to it that they did over at DC.
No,
whereas,
that's true.
I know. I think Archie Goodwin sweated blood to get Epic going, and
he did.
And running on the whole thing. And I think people respected him, but at a certain point, the corporate overlords were sitting there going, "How many issues?
Actually, how much money is it making? Exactly, it hasn't sold enough." So it did die sadly. I mean, it cast a big shadow, but it wasn't around for that long in the general scheme of things, which is a shame because they did some amazing work. They got some incredibly. I mean, Epic Illustrated. What's sad is that you've never had like a celebration of that, like a collection. But I guess the rights are so complicated that it would just be a minefield. I mean, certain things have been reprinted, like Black Dragon. I think there was a Titan edition that they did years ago, and a few others. But there are loads of other cool strips that no one's seen since.
Yeah,
that's the sad thing.
So it feels like for Marvel it crashed. I'm going to say that kind of that creative renaissance. It feels like it crashed in the '90s. DC it kept on going, as I'm going to say, into the 2000s.
Yes,
but then people feel like it's kind of Karen left. But I mean, it just feels like it all kind of petered out. I mean, some of the creators got quite wealthy, quite famous, moved solidly from England over to America. Probably living much lovely houses. But the part I miss is where is that next renaissance of just genuinely interesting comic content, for a wide stream audience. I mean, when's the next one that like a 24-year-old's going to want to read a comic book at? I mean, do I have to go to France or is there another place?
I don't know. I mean, Image are doing interesting books. I mean, there's a book called The Department of Truth, which is not bad. Which is one James Tynion. He was the protege of Scott Snyder, and that's drawn by a British artist, Martin Simmons, and that's quite good. It's like a kind of conspiracy book, and that's decent. I mean, I kind of wish I knew the answer. I'm sure they're out there, but I mean, I guess the thing about comics now is there are so many publishers, so there's a proliferation, and it's very hard to keep track of everything that's out there. I mean, Vault are doing some interesting books. Boom are doing some interesting books. I mean, Marvel. I mean, getting back to Marvel, they did have their Marvel Knights imprint, which crashed and burned after a while either. But they had some interesting. They had a few interesting books in there. Like they did a Doctor Strange book, which wasn't bad, and the Punisher book wasn't bad. There was a Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon Punisher, which they did, which is a slightly more adult take on the character. But I don't know. I mean, they're out there, but it's much harder to find them now. I mean, as you know, in the early 90s, it was a good bet that if you picked up a Vertigo book, you were likely to find something good. At that point, the quality was there, and they had a lot of really interesting stuff, a lot of really cool writers, some amazing artists, some interesting covers, and some really good different takes on either DC existing characters or on totally brand new creations. So I guess it's out there, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, the books I mentioned, the two magazines, the 77 and Shift, because the 77 also did a very lavish, did like a full color annual. Which I was trying to get hold of for you, which I'm going to still see if I can grab it for you. So it's possible that these guys, the creators working on those, because there are a lot of new faces, that they may end up working, they may move up the ladder, into a big. So that's the thing, is that the great thing about a grassroots thing like that, like the 77 or Shift, is that it encourages people, that they want to create comics and they're not quite ready for 2000 AD yet, but they're almost. So this is like the rung below, but I'm not saying that in a derogatory fashion. I'm saying this is a great way for people to cut their teeth so that they can write a few strips for the 77 and then go to 2000 AD and go, look, I've written 3 or 4 8-page shorts for this magazine and I think I'm ready. So these are great stepping stones for new creators. So certainly from the British perspective, these anthology is a great training ground because, if you're a writer, if you can tell a great story in 2 pages or 6 pages or 8 pages, then if you've got 22 pages, it almost feels like a luxury, but it really hones your craft as a creator. So it's great that we've got these anthologies out there at the moment.
Well, I mean, for me, the thing I guess I'm looking for is the same thing, and I guess I'm impressed by how similar comics and music are for me on this.
Yes.
It's just like, sometimes you're just lucky. You live in a place with an amazing radio station and it's going to keep on introducing new things, and that's great. I don't have that radio station in my life anymore. A lot, KITS out in the Bay Area for a long time it was amazing. Every time you turn it on, it's
So
like,
this was your local cable radio station, basically.
right. But there's some legendary ones down like KROQ,
Yeah, of course, I heard of that.
but where like they're constantly breaking new folks in. So like if you got played on there, it's like, hey, maybe we should check that out. I don't think there's a publisher with that kind of clout anymore.
No problem. I mean, the thing is, it has got. I think that the industry has become. I mean, a kind of diverse. When I say diverse, I mean it in a kind of lots of different imprints or different publishers' way. So it's. I mean, you could argue now that Marvel and DC, they don't have the dominance that they used to have. Basically, and other companies, we talked about Image. So Image has more clout.
But I mean, the one thing none of them have is a standpoint the way that Vertigo did. I mean,
no.
Which, by the way, can we just spend a moment marveling that the same comic company that its first releases were like Wildcats, Youngblood, Spawn, and Savage Dragon,
and you forgot about Shadowhawk as well.
Shadowhawk. But that suddenly has become the home, the mass market home of most creative.
It's incredible. I mean, it's just, as I said, that's you can thank Eric Stevenson, who's their, I guess he's their publisher now, but he started life as their managing editor.
But I would not call it 1992.
Oh no, I wouldn't either. 1992 was interesting because actually the first issue that we did of the magazine, we put a news story up about these former Marvel people setting up their own company. Basically, and it's just, as you say, it transformed Image thanks to Walking Dead and thanks to some other things. I mean, things like Saga, obviously, which is a huge hit. That's still a huge hit, and Image is incredible, as you say. If you compare the 92 Image to the 2004 Image or the 2006, they feel like totally different companies.
Yeah. But it's funny because going back to the idea again of discoverability, it's like you can either have a company like Vertigo that or in say music, say 4AD Records or Wax Tracks, right?
Or say Creation when they actually were on form for 5 minutes, when they actually had loads of cool bands before they were bought by Sony,
right?
But yeah.
But I mean, you can say, hey, if I like this band on this label, I'll probably like other things.
Yeah, no, there's definitely. It's about shared sensibilities with these bands or with these comics, as you say, for Vertigo. If you like Sandman, would you like Preacher? Possibly. I like both, but
I'd blow a couple bucks and give it a look. Sure.
Yeah,
why not?
No, you're right. As you say, if you like one. The other there was a book like Sandman Mystery Theater, which is an amazing book. Did you read any of those? That was the 30s, the 40s Sandman, the Wesley Dodd.
I did, and even that one ran through cycles.
But when it was on form, it was amazing. I mean, certain stories they really when it was an anthology, so obviously you had different artists and you're like 4-5 issue arcs, but when that was a really bold book because it took a slightly, well, let's be honest here, a not great old 40s DC superhero character.
Nobody cared about the Golden Age Sandman.
Not at all. But they filled that. They fleshed out the characters. They gave him the relationship with his girlfriend, and it was interesting, and it really and it was a more adult take on a silly bloke with a gas mask who'd shoot gas at people as he fought them. I mean, but it worked, because it was Vertigo, because it was a Vertigo book, and it had the same sensibilities as the best of the other Vertigo books.
So I'll say one more bit, and then unfortunately I have to wrap up. So yeah, and I guess I'm going to keep going back to music on this one. So you can either have a label, that has sensibility and say, hey, okay, if I like this, I'll probably check out something else by that label. Another thing that's often done in music is you just have these sampler albums.
Yes.
It's sort of like you think about 2000 AD. It's like, just some people can put out a really cool 2-3 page story. Maybe you're ready for your own book. Maybe you're not. But if you can do enough small things, and if you can read those, it was great. One thing I think Britain does really well is promoting, giving people a way to get their foot in the door that's still going to get seen by a wider audience. And I wish there was more of that in America. I think one thing that's great about comic books is everyone can get seen. You can put you can start a Kickstarter, you can put your foot in the door, but unless you're known on some other level, why would buy anything from you. I mean, it's like
No,
you
no,
just
you're right.
1,000 people with a book out this month.
I guess in some ways it's almost too democratizing.
Yeah, it's
Ironically,
is you want something where like, oh, okay, look, I know I'm going to buy 2080 for the Judge Dredd story, but while I'm there, maybe
yes,
I'll pick up this new thing.
yes,
And so you're always getting fed
yes,
this new
yes.
store stuff.
But before we wrap up, I'd like to plug, if I may, just a
I
couple
was
of
just
things.
about to invite you to. So, yes, once again, everyone, thank you. I'd like to thank our friend Joel for joining us here. And
Thank you for having me on.
and first of all, let's talk a little bit about your working with and how can they get it.
Okay, well, I mean, there's the website, which is tripwiremagazine.co.uk. We're also working on a brand new British comic show back in Bristol, which is back at the hotel where the old classic Bristol comic show used to take place. And people can go to our website, which I'm just about to look at, which is tripwirecomiccons.com. And they can also buy the last two print magazines from there if they go tripwirecomiccons.com/shop. So they can buy those last two print mags. We've got people like Howard Chaykin, Brian Stelfreeze, Jock, Sean Phillips, an amazing array of very talented people at the show, which is the 3rd and 4th of September. Admittedly, it's over here, so perhaps for the Americans it might be a little bit more of a challenge, but if they fancy a trip over to the UK, so there's that. We're also about to start work on a 30th anniversary book, which can be published by Heavy Metal, which will be funding through Zoop, but also published through Heavy Metal as well, so people can keep an eye out on the Tripwire website for further information about that.
Excellent, and I will try to update the show links so that we keep all these links in the program.
Great.
Anyway, thanks again very
Peace,
much.
it's been my pleasure. Thanks to everybody for listening and watching, and hope they enjoyed the show.
And one of these days, I'm going to get this StreamYard thing down so we can actually start a show properly. Thanks again.
Well, that was fun. You did it in the end.
We
got there in the end.
That's actually going to be on my gravestone.
That should be your slogan.
All right,
thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks again. All right, guys, and thank you all for joining us. We're like I say, this interviewing thing is new to us, but we're trying very hard. Thank you for watching. We're not going to have a show next week. I'm going to be down in Florida, taking in some sun, and summer's just about ready to start. And I hope you guys get a chance to knock back and have a cold one and enjoy the weather as well. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time. About 2 weeks. Bye bye.